So, hello everyone, Happy New Year and welcome back to our NL seminar series. Today it is our great pleasure to have Arjun Subramonian as our guest speaker. They are computer science, PhD computer science students at the University of California, Los Angeles. Their research focuses on inclusive graph, machine learning, and natural language processing, including fairness, bias, ethics, and integrating queer perspectives. They are further a core organizer of Queer in AI. Today, they will give a presentation on bias and power in NLP. As a reminder, there will be a QA session at the end of the talk, if we still have room for that, of course, but feel free to ask your questions anytime you might have them throughout the talk. And as usual, for online participants, please keep muting your mics unless if you have a question or comments to ensure the clarity of the talk. Please join me in welcoming Arjun, and I hope you enjoy his talk. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Miriam gave a great introduction, but yeah, the title of my talk is Bias and Power in NLP, and I want to say that these slides do contain examples of some stereotypes and associations that could be offensive and triggering. Okay, so I guess the way that I'm going to do this talk is not like, here's my project, here's the introduction, here are the methodology and everything, but I'm going to kind of integrate it into the broader landscape of how I perceive bias in NLP and kind of connecting that to harms and maybe a more justice-oriented approach going into the future. So to begin with, everybody uses an NLP. Y'all are familiar with these things like writing suggestions in Grammarly, machine translation, toxicity detection. We've had this kind of question pop up a lot in recent years about whether these applications have biases, kind of motivated by a lot of empirical investigations into this. Let's take that machine translation example from the previous slide, where we want to translate "my friend is a doctor" into the same thing in Spanish. So if you looked at Google Translate in maybe like 2016 or something, you would translate "my friend's doctor" into "mi amigo es doctor." And this kind of is, the assumption here is that you're translating doctor into masculine. You know, you might say, well, maybe that's just the generic within Spanish, and so it's okay to do that. However, we also would just want to have representation of both "mi amiga es doctora" as well as "mi amigo es doctor" when we're doing these translations. And so we see now Google Translate has kind of shifted and now provides both of these translations. But in some senses, this is one form of a bias that could manifest, right? Like we're kind of implicitly centering the masculine morpheme here, or in general, maybe even assuming that all doctors are men. And that was, again, one example of bias, but you might ask, like, bias seems like a very overloaded term. You might have heard of it from statistics. You might have heard of implicit bias before. There are a lot of different ways in which bias is used. So, you know, we might ask, what exactly is bias? So there are a whole lot of definitions of bias that I can think of, at least in the context of NLP. There's kind of an umbrella definition that I'm providing here. That's my definition, a lot of different definitions. I kind of consider it unjust, unfair, or prejudicial treatment by a model of people who face discrimination and marginalization in society. And some examples of this include representation biases. Maybe you have stereotypes of different groups, and underrepresentation or overrepresentation of different groups in your training data, as well as the predictions that your model is making. There's also quality of service biases. So suppose that for a lot of marginalized users, your model just does not perform as well for them. Then that degrades their experience with the model, and that degrades their quality of service. Compute. I know Katie was just complaining about lack of access to compute. And so there's a lot of lack of access to compute throughout the world, especially in the global south, and that constitutes another bias. And languages. We claim to make a lot of multilingual language models that comprise English, French, German, and Spanish, and pretty much no other language in the world. And so we tend to have this, we tend to center global languages from the global north. And you'll notice that all these different definitions of bias overlap quite a bit. Some of them may seem as causes of other biases, but they're all in some ways unjust or unfair on the kind of prejudicial treatment of some group of people. I do want to say here that many papers do lack a very clear conceptualization of what bias is. We see papers coming out that are like, yeah, we're tackling bias in this model. but I have no idea what they mean. It's like, is it like stereotypes with respect to gender and occupations? Like, can you please be more specific about what you mean? So I kind of want to make it a goal that people are more explicit about how they conceptualize bias when talking about it. Yes.
So I was wondering about like the kind of angle on bias of like I'm absent explanatory information. I'm making a decision on a class on some kind of classification that like is using a prior that where like things are not exploring enough to understand. Like for example, like a heteronormative bias of like, well, hello, male presenting person. I assume you're looking for a girlfriend or something like that. Would you say that is covered in some of your definitions here, or that it's specifically excluded, or that it's something else to consider? Or how does that factor that? I'm not sure if that factors into one of those angles or not.
It probably factors into like all of them,
okay,
and the ... as well. So it's kind of a very like a lot of fluid categories. There's stereotypes about heteronormativity that kind of factor into norms we have about it. Clearly, if I were to see something like are you looking for a girlfriend? My quality of service would be degraded, and so it kind of fits in there as well. Yeah, and I don't have compute, so I would not have made that model to begin with. So yeah, I'm going to go through some more examples of what I was talking about previously. So this is from a very seminal paper by Kai-Wei Chung from a few years ago about word embeddings and how they can be dreadfully sexist. So the task here is to use word embeddings to complete the analogy he is to something in the left column as she is to something in the right column. And the first few seem okay, right? Like he is to uncle as she is to aunt. He is to lion as she is to lioness. And then we're like, whoa, he is to surgeon as she is to nurse. And he is to professor as she is to associate professor. Like all these things are very, like they capture a lot of the stereotypes that are present within the data, and also just the kind of co-occurrences of different phrases that the word embeddings are picking up from our training corpus. And so this is an example of representation bias. We're really here capturing a lot of the stereotypes about binary gender that are being in our training data. There's also this paper on adversarial triggers, and you might have seen this where you can kind of throw in a prompt. I believe this is GPT-2. I'm not going to read out the prompt, but you can throw in a prompt and it'll start outputting a whole lot of text that's very offensive. And it's not even just like adversarial triggers. Like I don't have to throw in like phrases that are maybe kind of not intelligible. So I did this with ChatGPT like a few days ago. I said, write an intense political ad about homosexuality. And I got a bunch of stuff about we must protect the traditional family and defend the sanctity of marriage. Preserve the moral fabric of our society. And these are important things that you want to include in a political ad. And yeah, these kinds of things are like you can throw in certain prompts and get models to respond in ways that cause the models to throw out stereotypes about different groups, to degrade my experience with ChatGPT as a user. And yeah, that's kind of some more biases there. So this is from a paper that we wrote in 2021 on gender exclusivity in language technologies, in particular how our treatment of gender within NLP is very binary. So this, is another example of a quality of service bias. So let's just take the top sentence here, and it's a co-reference resolution task. In the sentence, Alan and Amy went to the market, and Amy asked Alan if he wants anything. And so the goal here is to match all the expressions in this sentence that refer to the same entity. So we see at the top that I got Alan, he, that refers to the same entity, and Amy, and Amy refer to the same entity. We don't actually know what pronouns Alan or Amy use, but we're just going to go with the fact that Alan uses he pronouns up at the top. And then if we tried the same thing in the second sentence, but we change the he to they, we're assuming that Alan uses they pronouns. We see that they is just not like connected to any of the entities there. And this is definitely a quality of service bias. You can also attribute to a whole lot of other things like representation bias. Maybe there's just not a whole lot of people who use they pronouns within your training data, which actually we did do analyses on, and I'll present them in a few seconds, about how singular they is highly underrepresented in like Wikipedia data. Okay, so before I jump into that, I kind of want to talk about some sources of these biases that I just mentioned, and again, connecting it back to some of the work that I've done recently. So before we kind of jump into these things, I really want to emphasize that NLP models are sociotechnical systems. We are there's a pipeline by which we build NLP models. There is infrastructure generated around NLP models, and everything along this pipeline contributes to bias. It's not just the training data, right? So it's kind of like these historical biases, a term that I'm not, particularly happy with, because there's, they're kind of still there today. They're not like past inequities, but just in the ways in which data is generated, whether it be hiring data at different companies, like this captures a lot of things like sexism, racism, homophobia, and then the ways in which we're doing sampling on this data. We don't know which kind of groups of people we're excluding when we kind of curating our data set. How are we doing annotation? How are we measuring people's identities in particular? We know that with the US Census, race is defined as per 5 different categories, which are like I don't understand how they came up with those categories. They're very reflective, again, of historical biases, but yet we still do measurement with them, and that's kind of problematic. And then there's also learning biases, right? Like, again, it's not just the training data. We are optimizing for overall utility in a lot of cases. We're optimizing not for fairness, but we're optimizing for just kind of overall accuracy and without thinking about the constitution of our evaluation sets. And also deployment biases, like who is this model being deployed on? Like, we have these things, and I'll talk about this more when it comes to justice, but we can make our recidivism prediction models fair, but if they're being disproportionately deployed and on Black individuals, it doesn't really matter if they're fair. We're kind of like already choosing a certain group of people on whom we're deploying these models and then subjecting them to cyclical incarceration, etc. So to dive into some of these parts of the pipeline, especially with respect to data curation and learning biases, skewed samples end up causing a lot of biases. So this is an example from the paper that we did on gender exclusivity. We looked at Wikipedia text from March of 2021 alone. It's about 4.5 billion tokens. And we looked at the composition of these different pronouns. And in this case, they is both singular and plural. But he is 15 million, has 15 million occurrences within the data. She has 4.8 million occurrences within data. And then when we get to like neo-pronouns like Z and Z, we get 4.5 thousand. And actually, most of these are corporations. Like most of these are like the instances are like corporation abbreviations like XE and Polish words. So it's not even like occurrences of neo-pronouns. It's very sad.
What are they actually supposed to be for those of us who are a little ignorant?
They're supposed to be just like pronouns that individuals use, like neo-pronouns. Like I guess within the last 2 years, people have been opting for more gender-neutral terms besides he, she, and they that fit their identity. Yeah, so people are using these terms, but they're definitely not reflected in like Wikipedia text at all.
So, for example, Z, Z goes like Z, and then the accusative is here, HIR, and then the genitive is here's, HIRS, and ZXE just works like same grammatically the same as they them, but with an X.
Yeah. So yeah, that's great explanation. So like Z is at the market. No, you're really fine. It's basically just using a sentence like Z is at the market. I told Sam this, right? It's just like kind of taking any of these pronouns for singular and then adapting it. Language evolves. Language is cool. But yeah, we kind of see that with this kind of disparities in the representation of different pronouns, this leads to a lot of issues because if we don't see things like singular they and we don't see things like singular Z, we can start assuming people's pronouns. Language models start hallucinating things. We can start perpetrating misgendering. We can start erasing the existence of non-binary people and trans people entirely because the models are not capable of generating sentences or recognizing entities that use these pronouns. And then the outputs of models, as we see, especially with automation bias and everything, are viewed as sources of truth or scientific knowledge. Galactica, right? Like with Facebook and everything, people kind of tend to think that what a model outputs is correct, especially if they're not doing NLP research or they're not doing AI research. And then this causes human authors and other language models, right? Because we have now this situation where language models are taking in text generated by other language models and stereotypically portray non-binary individuals or ignore them. And then guess what kind of goes back into the erasure cycles as this amplification of erasure over and over again. So I actually do have an example of language models taking input from other language models. A lot of the, I'm not gonna say where this was, but a lot of like machine translation models nowadays that train on underrepresented languages incorporate more language, from scraping the internet. And a lot of these sites that they're getting the information from are actually porn sites that were automatically translated. So languages like Basque have a lot of toxic translations simply because most of the data is scraped from Basque porn sites. Yeah, that's really bad. Tainted examples.
Does that mean that like these are the only places that this kind of data can be found? Like it's hard to find Basque except for porn sites?
So that I don't know enough about. I would assume that like it forms a large portion of the data on the internet, but I mean, I don't actually know how much Basque text exists on the internet. Like, I'm not too well versed on like how Spain like subjected Basque people to like decades of not being able to speak Basque and how that like reflects in online forums or other places where you can access Basque text.
I don't know about Basque specifically, but the prevailing estimate is that like 50% of the total traffic and content on the web is porn.
Okay, so just in general, everything. I guess the question is whether the language distribution on porn versus not porn is the same. Just a topic for a totally different research paper.
Yeah, that's not the base rule that I want to use right now.
Basque is thriving from what I understand. So it was heavily suppressed during the Franco dictatorship, obviously, but there's a strong community, university, and this region.
Right. I mean, it is doing much better now.
Wise, it's a relatively small section of Spain.
Yes. I mean, I'm not going to get into it even further, but so when I was in like the Basque country, right, like there's a lot of issues where people don't speak Basque simply because like their parents kind of lost that during the Franco dictatorship, and then when one person in the group doesn't speak Basque, then everyone switches to Spanish, and then that becomes a thing where like Spanish is reinforced. So it's like language-based cultural assimilation is like so easy to perpetuate in that way.
Your model on the last page, the cycle, right? Like works the same way. It said human authors and language models. Yeah, like it's the same thing.
Yeah, there's actually a really good. I should put that here. But if you're interested, my friend was on the Basque radio and talked about large language models in Basque and like the intersections of those two. I can send you a link if you're curious about that. Okay, tainted examples is another thing here. So this is kind of based on when the supposedly ground truth data that we have that we're training our models on reflect a lot of stereotypes and historical inequities. So this was a great paper by Martin on looking at the racial biases within toxicity detection. So because a lot of the annotators that we have in deciding whether things are toxic or not, or even just content moderators, for real on Twitter, decide whether something is toxic or not. They are overwhelmingly white men, and they are not very well versed in African American English, and so they kind of overwhelmingly decide that African American vernacular English is inherently toxic. And this is definitely reflected in things like Perspective API, which is a very common toxicity classifier. We see that just very common phrases used by Black individuals on Twitter are labeled as like highly toxic. And that's definitely not the same for a lot of text that comes from white individuals. Another example of tainted examples is Amazon's resume screening system. So they used to have a system where they would take in resumes and they would look at whether the person could potentially be a good candidate. And they found out for some reason, women were just not passing the resume screening at all. And it's because, well, the people who they were using training data from the past 10 years of hiring in Amazon, and Amazon's not particularly the most like gender inclusive place in the world. And there was a lot of sexism reflected in whether someone was decided to be a good candidate and the associations of that with the content of the resume. In fact, they found the resumes that were being rejected the most are the ones that contained any terms related to women. So society, women, engineers, scripts, like these words were like just instantly causing resumes to get rejected from the screening system. Some more examples here, sample size disparities. So I talked about this earlier from the paper that we had a couple of years ago. Feels weird to say like a couple of years ago, like 2021. But the ways in which these disparities in the training data set translate into the learning algorithm is very like pronounced. So if we were to train glove embeddings on the Wikipedia data that I mentioned earlier, if we take the word pronoun and then look at the closest neighbors of the word he in like the embedding space that we have glove, we see like, you know, his, man, himself, right? Like these things are expected. Similarly with she, right? Like these things seem okay. And even for they, because again, we're including, it's really hard to disambiguate between singular and plural. But as soon as we get to like the neo-pronouns, like what are these? Like these are Polish words and corporations, right? Like we can see that it picked up that those were the primary instances of these two terms. And similarly for evaluation, so this is from the data set Mimic, which is a clinical notes data set. And it kind of like has some notes about diagnoses based on like patients, based on nurses and doctors' notes about the patient. And we see that, like, for example, Asian individuals comprise 1.9% of the test data set. So there's some evaluation biases there, right? Like you can get 98.1% accuracy on that training set, or on that test set rather, and be like, I did great, and it just like does not work for anybody who's Asian. And I guess the other thing I want to make clear here is that a lot of people, when they see this, are like, just collect more training data, right? Like just do it, like get more training data. First of all, it's very hard, but on top of that, we need to be careful about predatory inclusion here. We can kind of go out to different places, use people's labor very exploitatively, collect more data about them. But if we don't think about the deployment biases, where these models are being deployed, and it doesn't positively impact these individuals on who you're collecting more data, to whose benefit is that? Like, it's very predatory to do something like that. And the last one we're going to talk about here is proxies. So this is also from our paper. We have the sentence, John ate mask sandwich, they were hungry. So this is where the kind of the models start hallucinating pronouns, right? Like we get the very explicit indication here that John uses they pronouns. However, if we look at the kind of scores predicted by the mass language model demo on NLP, we see that we get John ate his sandwich as the top prediction, 60%. In fact, I don't think any of these are they. So it's like John ate a sandwich, John ate another sandwich, right? Like John ate another sandwich is over John ate their sandwich, like amongst all the things that could possibly fill that Moss token. And the reason for this is because the model is clearly using John as a proxy for masculinity and kind of filling in terms that are masculine in order to kind of conform to the co-occurrence distributions that we see within our training data.
It's interesting about the John ate her sandwich case. Presumably John is not going to have her as a pronoun, and that's reinforced with the they were hungry thing, right?
Yeah.
But the sandwich could belong to somebody else, right? And that's true for the first sentence too. And so it's kind of hedging its bets. It's using the mass. So it's got the like, okay, there's like I have a prior that John and his are linked, right? And also like it could be somebody else's sandwich, right? And so I'm gonna yeah, it's very biased against that being a singular they that runs, or even a plural they that runs a sandwich, right? It could be like the cabal's sandwich, right? John ate their sandwich,
right?
And like not even going to consider it.
So I guess like the latter case there of like collective ownership of the sandwich, right? Like I think that generally like people don't collectively own sandwiches, so I kind of would expect that. There's not a sandwich cabal or whatever, but I feel like just that alone, like the fact that there's no there here.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, you can say like the deli down the corner really like their sandwich.
Right, but actually that would be a great case of singular they, right? Because like that would, I mean, so
depends on who. Like,
okay.
The corporations are singular. Like British wise would definitely say that is 12%
what's your lunch? John is apparently eating other people's stuff. That's not me. But
Yeah.
I suppose you could also make the contrarian argument that like maybe John uses he, they pronouns, and so both are correct.
Mhm.
But I agree that you would probably want to see they above he.
At least somewhere in the distribution. Right?
At least somewhere, or even just like if you don't know their pronouns at all, maybe John ate John sandwich or like John ate their sandwich. Because I feel like we still don't have enough information about like what pronouns they may use from like the sentence alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're trying to shy away from like assuming pronouns like a the sandwich or a the sandwich are fairly acceptable.
Mhm.
And for sure, the period is not causing there to not be any attention paid to, like, it could be that the period, without the second sentence, generated sandwich is fine, right? And if the model is not allowed to attend across sentential boundaries, then that would make sense. But
Right. So I guess this is something that we had done in the paper. I don't have all the results here, but like we generated some templates where effectively we like kind of swapped out the pronouns in the second sentence, like he, she, they, and then used like the topmost gender neutral names like in the US. And we found that the second sentence pronoun was like consistently used, predicted for the mask, as long as it was like he or she. Yeah. All right, so we've talked about bias, but now I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit from bias to harms. So bias is great. I think like it's like an interesting tool for looking at kind of the outputs of models or training data or thinking about it, maybe even statistically. But I think all of us here really care about making the world a better place, right? And like not harming individuals. So we want to see how these biases translate into harms in the real world when these models are actually deployed. So there's representational harms that we might expect. These include the stereotypes that we mentioned earlier, negative generalizations, misrepresentation of different groups. These are awful because we kind of see that if you have a model like ChatGPT that's just like throwing out stereotypes, I'm not having a good time. But then there's also like allocative harms that result from this. That's when we really see an unfair distribution of resources because of the kinds of biases that these models contain. A lot of unfair consequence. Maybe someone doesn't get a loan. Maybe someone doesn't get hired at Amazon because like their resume contains the word women in it, right? Like these are all kind of very serious harms that arise from models having biases. And in particular, I want to like drill in that as language models are becoming increasingly prevalent in these critical decision-making systems, which impact people. We want to make sure that we don't make worse the harms that are already posed to already marginalized communities within our society. We don't want to basically be reinforcing the inequality and power relations that exist within, our context at least. So yeah, I think like this is kind of the motivation for some of that paper that I talked about on gender exclusivity. Like we surveyed a bunch of non-binary individuals, in particular, asked them about harms that they'd experienced or that they would expect to see, or if they just played around with the NLP demo with different prompts and like looked at what they got, what kind of representational allocational harms would they experience for these different tasks: named entity recognition, co-reference resolution, and machine translation. And so, right, like if we see a lot of things in representational harms for NER where we're systematically mistagging neopronouns and singular they as non-person entities, we saw that, right? Like we see that it's just not working for these individuals, it's not representing them in the outputs. We can also see that this translates into real world issues, because if we have the same system that's based on this NER or co-ref building block to look at the instances of discrimination in historical documents against non-binary and trans individuals towards counting instances of these discrimination to enact more anti-discrimination policies, we see it's going to undercount instances of discrimination against trans and non-binary folks, simply because it doesn't recognize them as entities. And that's a serious problem, because it's going to delay the kind of legislation that we need for the sake of keeping trans and non-binary folks safer. So how do we go about measuring biases, evaluating biases such that in a way that's kind of like thinking about their harms? So the way that people tend to do this It's often based on contrasting sentence pairs or some kind of toxicity detection in the case of language generation. So on the left-hand side, we have this NLI-based bias evaluation, where we have a premise and a hypothesis. So the premise is the doctor is driving, and the hypothesis is he is driving. And we see that the NLI model here is like, yep, there's a high entailment there, that he is driving because we said that the doctor is driving. But if we look at the contrasting case here, where the premise is the doctor is driving and the hypothesis now she is driving, we see that it thinks that there's a much lower entailment there of the hypothesis being true. So now you might ask, how reflective is this of like the real world use cases of such a model? Well, we don't really know actually, right? Because I don't know how many people type in the doctor is driving, he is driving on a daily basis. I feel like that's not the primary use case of most of the LLMs that are kind of coming out. But this is one way that people do it. It's not super grounded in any real world use case. And that actually might be a pitfall that I'll talk about in a second. With regards to looking at free-form generation, take that same example from earlier where we're looking at defending our moral fabric. And we put this through a machine learning based toxicity classifier to look at biases that it may have. But if you recall from the tainted example slide a few slides back, these toxicity classifiers are not foolproof, right? They actually don't undercount instances of toxicity. They misrepresent different kinds of language. For example, African American vernacular English as toxic language, even when it's not. So this is also not foolproof. So there's some pitfalls here.
Did you try the doctor as a name, essentially in the sandwich sentence? Like the doctor ate mask sandwich. He was hungry versus she was hungry, and just at least see if it's able to make that consistency.
I don't remember if we tried that, but that would be interesting. That's a really good point. But like the doctor ate their sandwich.
Well, so there's the name challenge too, but I'm just.
Oh, like Dr. She.
You just tried the doctor ate mask sandwich. He was hungry and she was hungry.
Right.
If it's going to resolve his sandwich and her sandwich.
Right. I think so. That one I definitely have tried. We don't have data kind of aggregated for that, but most definitely it says like the doctor ate his sandwich.
She was hungry.
Oh, but the second thing was she was hungry. In that case, it definitely actually would say she is.
So it's at least able to get.
Yeah, John ate her sandwich. Yeah, the doctor ate her sandwich. Right. It does get past that when it's kind of like when that signal is explicitly there that the person is she, then it would put in her. But yeah, again, I don't have data for that. It's like me just playing around with like that NLP demo. So there are a whole lot of pitfalls that I kind of want to. So most of this talk is kind of like focusing on the pitfalls of like bias evaluation, the way we currently do it. So this is a table from a paper by Sula and Blodgett on an inventory of pitfalls in fairness benchmark data set. That's the best name ever. It's called Stereotyping Norwegian Salmon. And you'll see why if you read the paper. But there's some examples here of different ways in which, different issues with the ways in which we're kind of measuring these biases. We might have conflation of different stereotypes, logical failures. My favorite is like the unmarkedness issue, which is the second to last row in the table, which is where you're looking at which one does a language model prefer probabilistically. Like what is the probability of generating that sequence of words? It's like the straight man drew his gun and fired, or the gay man drew his gun and fired. I'm like, who said the straight man drew his gun and fired? I feel like that's just assumed, right? Like you're straight until someone says that you're gay. And so like it's that kind of like contrast there. We don't really know what that entails for the bias evaluation, because clearly the straight man drew his gun and fired is not is not something that most people would say. Some other pitfalls, and this comes from a paper that we wrote in early 2022. They're very Anglo-centric. So a lot of these gender bias evaluations focus on Western professions, things like doctor, receptionist, nurse, and not things like priest or other professions that you might find in other contexts. Also, a lot of biases are very grounded in the global north. I think one that I've been very interested in the past year is like caste bias in Hindi. And there's an excellent paper on this called Socially Aware Bias Measurements for Hindi Language Representations. There's a lot of ways in which people's names and the kinds of jobs that they hold are related to people's caste, and that kind of manifests when we're looking at biases in Hindi language representations. So we need to more critically examine social context, right? Like we're coming at this overwhelmingly from a US kind of global north perspective. And we do need to be integrating some more voices from the global south. And specifically like thinking about this with a global context in mind to realize that like reflexively, we are not the world, right? And like a lot of the biases that we uncover are not going to be even relevant to a lot of other portions of the world. We must also, I think, co-design these more culturally aware bias measurements, with those whose languages and cultures are actively being excluded in NLP. Other thing is we're kind of focused on prestige forms of English. We're kind of reincarnating a lot of the toxicity classifier problems, where the people who are coming up with these templates, they speak a very specific, academic standard North American English dialect. And that definitely also influences the way in which we view evaluation. It's also a lot of false claims of external validity. If you've worked these templates in bias evaluation, you'll see that there's a lot of poor syntactic diversity in the evaluations that are being run. They're very acontextual, right? Like with the contrasting sentence pair, I don't know what downstream application that's going to be used in, but I'm running the bias evaluation anyways upstream. But again, that I don't know what the implications of the upstream evaluation are for any kind of like downstream task that I'm going to be using that model in. We also really need to go beyond binary gender. This is one of those like thinking traps that I think a lot of computer scientists, myself included, fall in. All the papers like overwhelmingly focus on binary gender as kind of like this example of like two groups, with respect to which you can balance some kind of prediction. But like, how do we know that it, expands to race or like queerness or anything? Like it really doesn't. And actually, that's why I really like Katie's work, kind of looking at like these data sets that are specifically with respect to anti-queer biases, because the ways in which toxic language and stereotypes manifest is so different for different identities and different groups. It's not enough to be like, yeah, this works for men and women, so right, like, we're good. We can do this for any two groups in society. I think we also need to go beyond binary gender when we do these evaluations. So I haven't made that case clear enough from like the past few slides, but also not incrementally. I think there's the idea that gender is a starting point, race is like a second step, and then like we'll kind of slowly get there and cover all identities. But that's like not the case. There's no reason that binary gender is on a path towards looking at harms and biases against non-binary trans people, or any group for that matter. Like this is kind of like relationality, the concept of relationality from intersectionality. Like there are so many different ways in which groups are different. Of course, we all face some sort of shared oppression. But we do need to be we can't be identity agnostic. We can't erase people's identity towards making a general framework for bias evaluation. And with all these false claims of external validity, we may actually be causing further epistemic violence onto marginalized people by creating a veneer of fairness. We run this evaluation, we say, I got 0% bias in my model, and therefore it's ready to be deployed. No, please don't do that. I feel like for the most part, it depends on how you run your bias evaluation. But I think bias evaluation should be a good indication of how your model can go wrong. And then you need to continually monitor the model afterwards, because you can never say a model is bias-free, especially given how high stakes something like that statement is, without continual evaluation. We also use a lot of measurements of identity that are very unreliable or problematic, right? For example, a lot of these template-based data sets for binary gender bias are based on pronouns or like gender names, and they use that to infer people's gender or as a proxy for the gender. That's not exactly great. It's like reinforcing biases in other ways towards like a lot of trans and non-binary people. And things like sexuality and disability are often unobservable from text alone. It's just because of the ways in which certain things are considered taboo or confidential, or the norms around ability and heteronormativity kind of lead us to act within this context. We don't often communicate that in the same explicit ways we might with other kinds of identities in language. And ultimately, we have this tendency to assume that all these identities are somewhat known and like measurable and discrete and immutable and non-intersecting. It really does not capture the full fluidity of which people's identities kind of occur. And finally, there's a lot of like there's a lot of basis in parity. I think like we have one conceptualization of biased measures that we kind of rely upon overwhelmingly within our community. It's like if we have the same amount of bias for both groups, we're good. But this kind of push towards neutrality definitely reinforces a lot of existing power relations within society, right? Like there's this great example from the Intersectionality book by Patricia Hill Collins, where it says like you can't, they talk about the FIFA World Cup and how you have like a team from Morocco on one side. They don't talk about that because that just happened recently, but like, you know, they have a team from Morocco on one side and a team from France on the other side. And in terms of resources and ability, to play and like kinds of racial discrimination that are faced, the playing field is like not level, right? Like we have France all the way up here and we have Morocco on the other side. And the referee kind of is this performative, like individual is like, yeah, we're gonna make this game fair, make sure everyone gets the same advantages, like keeps, enforce the rules correctly. So you're basically just letting Morocco continue to slide at the rate that they're already sliding, like down this playing field. And that's kind of what that push toward neutrality does. And we don't consider other forms of justice here, right? Distributive or representational justice. There's so many other ways that we could think of justice. And Ready to Baby has done great work on this topic. So I really encourage improving bias evaluation through a lot more reflexive documentation. I think transparency is a very good first step towards kind of tackling these problems. Like, how do you define bias? And how does this definition of bias align with definitions of harm? Are you using proxies to infer people's identities? Are there any other data sets that already exist to do this measurement? How does your benchmark kind of address issues that that other benchmark is not addressing? Or what are some problems with those data sets? I think we need a lot more documentation for the data we do, not just in bias evaluation, of course, like just across the board, but I think, it's especially critical in this space when we're talking about harms and biases. So this is some ongoing work with some people at Microsoft Research Fate. And this is just general evaluation in NLP, but I kind of would like people to be more specific about what kind of capabilities do they want their models to have, and what is that benchmark assessing by testing a model with a data set, a metric. Like, what are you hoping to see that the model possesses as a result of it doing well on your benchmark? And how may correct outputs, like for example, toxicity labels, be contested, in your benchmark? How may acceptable methods of solving the task or unacceptable methods be allowable or not? And I'm not going to read through all this stuff here, but I think like one question that I really want people to take away and like even just start writing the limitations section of their paper, maybe not in the limitation section. I don't like the idea of the limitation section, but like, limitations throughout the paper. What does it mean for your model if it achieves a perfect score on your task or your benchmark or your like bias evaluation data set? Like, what does it actually mean for society? Like, what could you take away from that? What is the implication of achieving such a number? And in the process of proposing that benchmark, are you limiting progress to only working on one conceptualization of bias? Are you saying that parity-based bias is the only way forward? Or are you holding space for others to propose alternatives? This has very real consequences, right? Like the ways, and if I do anything that's not like parity-based bias, with a few exceptions, I probably won't get funding, right? Like there's this very kind of attractive nature to being able to measure bias in this, like, these two quantities are equal, and now I'm able to solve it kind of way. Like that's what the NSF kind of really likes. There are also some ways for mitigating bias in contextual representation. So the reason I'm talking about this is the work that I did when I was a research engineer at Allen NLP, built their fairness library for the Allen NLP, fairness toolkit for the Allen NLP library. I'm very sad. Apparently they're shutting it down. So use it while you can, I guess. I guess they're just not maintaining it anymore is what I mean. But yeah, there's some techniques out there. For example, I think like the reason I'm talking about contextual representations here is when you use contextualization, right? Like you're not just doing projections on embeddings. You're not just removing things from static word embeddings. Like the context in which a word occurs in a sentence affects the kinds of biased information that the representation for that word captures. Like, when you have a whole sentence, things like she, gets a lot of information propagated from words like the doctor, and that matters. So there's some techniques here. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this for now, but you have my slides. So I kind of implemented some of these techniques at NLP and saw some improvements. Not a whole lot. And again, I also don't know what the implications of these tests actually mean for any downstream applications. The reason I put those up here is I feel like I've kind of changed my perspective a lot in like the last 2 years since like March 2021 when I did this. And I kind of like to see like how my view on like fairness and bias has changed throughout the last ever amount of time. So there are, again, of course, you know me, pitfalls. I like talking about pitfalls. Pitfalls of bias mitigation. Bias mitigation has to go hand in hand with real world auditing. The problem is it's, however, like very often post hoc. Like it's kind of weird that we train a model that's like supposed to be good and then we de-bias it afterwards, right? Like why is that not like the first intent, you know, from the beginning? Why is it always that the model is something and then we strip away the bad parts of it? Because that inevitably reinforces a lot of the issues that exist in the model. Again, false claims of external validity like before. And I think the thing that's most important to me is the fact that it ignores historical and social context. We don't tell the model anything about the civil rights movement in like the US. We don't tell the model anything about slavery. We don't tell the model anything about Stonewall or whatever, right? We kind of just are like, here's two groups, any two groups, like just make sure that the bias is the same for both of them. And by ignoring the historical and social context, we can't really accommodate any sort of reparative interventions to remedy inequity. We don't have the context to actually identify certain stereotypes and know about like what is the origin of that? How harmful is that stereotype? Right? We just treat everything as the same. And then we also, going back to the whole Morocco-France thing, like we should not just be like letting people slide the same rate down a field. Like we should be turning the field up so that it's like slightly more level. And that's what I mean by reparative interventions. And so this is again the paper from that I was on from early 2022, and kind of the concluding note of this, shifting from bias and harms to social justice. So the discussions on large language models cannot be divorced from the wider power structures within which they exist. There's a whole lot of things here, kind of going back to the compute bias, like language bias. Large language models are expensive. Who is making large language models? Like primarily Google and Facebook in a very centralized way. You know, you can access their models sometimes on like from like, you know, their servers. And I don't think that one model that's super scalable and supposedly inclusive but sits on the server in Menlo Park is going to be applicable to anybody who's living in like Nairobi. There's definitely a mismatch there. Scale is definitely a nemesis to inclusivity. A lot of the reasons these biases pop up is because we're attempting to make these models at scale and claiming that they're inclusive, when in reality, we have to privilege some group over another group inherently if we're making these models really big and saying they work for everybody. Language is multicultural, right? But large language models are not. We can feed them language, but there's no kind of input about race or ethnicity. Not everybody who speaks French the same way. People speak French in former colonies of France, right? That's super different than like anything that anyone in like Ile-de-France would speak. But we know that the culture there actually matters when they're speaking the language. And also the fact that only a few people can make large language models allows a lot of powerful actors to control research. Right? I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly, I don't know who sponsors ISI. I'm not particularly comfortable with Redacted, you know, in charge of like all my large language models, especially given other awful things that they've done in the past. This is a very interesting table that I liked that we kind of threw together in the paper, looking at the author location and languages of different large language models that have been released. So we see primarily locations like US and China. Multinational mostly just means US, like maybe like one person from Australia or something. And the language are like English, Chinese. That's pretty much it actually. And then multilingual is again like Spanish, German, French, like the usual like romantic languages, romance languages rather from the global north. So that's kind of the impetus here to start thinking about a more justice-grounded approach to NLP and bias and harms in general. I think our goal here for anyone who's working on bias, or just, I mean, everyone should be thinking about the ethics of their technology, but we care about minimizing social inequality. I hope like everybody in this room cares about reducing social inequality. And I think we need to be careful, think of like be more explicit, even in our papers, of how are we grounding the work that we're doing in social inequality. I really like the gender shades paper in some ways, just because they talk about how like the fact that the reason they're focusing on gender recognition in commercial technologies is because those things actually get used by law enforcement, right? They're integrating that social context into their motivation for making that, for doing that project. And their goal is to reduce social inequality because law enforcement primarily targets Black individuals, especially Black men. There's also a lot of power relations that when you think about how is your NLP system like centralizing power? How is it decentralizing power? How is it participating in existing power relations? And context is key, right? Going back to the stuff about how a lot of our stuff is very Anglo-centric. What about the rest of the world? Like we are not the world. Like, you know, us here in this 6th floor conference room overlooking the marina is not the world. And co-creation. How can we better create sustained partnerships with different communities towards making a technology that works for all of them better? Yeah, how can we just equip different communities to make their own models so that it better represents their context and not kind of rely on, you know, our understanding of like the US and Los Angeles and the other things. There's another thing that's like not here that I meant to add, but it's infrastructures. I think whenever I talk about this, a lot of folks assume that it's like on them as individuals to fix this, but that's so hard. And like the ways in which academia operate and which like conferences operate make it nearly impossible to address any of these things. If you're submitting to ACL and you have 8 pages, who's going to talk about power relations, right? Like you're like looking to squeeze that the tech table into like the 7th page. And so we do need to have these discussions with the broader ACL community and other communities that everyone's part of towards kind of providing more space for people to be more reflexive and critical of their own work and thinking about its role in society, who's using it, who's it being used on. I really like the broader impact and limitation sections that we're doing now. And I think they're actually very good steps. Response to NLP checklist that all of you are going to be filling out, that's a very good step towards kind of being more reflexive in this way. Some more reading, some of the papers that I touched upon that I was co-author on. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions in the last 4 minutes that we have here.
Thank you so much, Arjun, for the great and insightful talk. And now I will open the floor to more questions from the audience. Yes.
So I know this is just like an example you're giving, but I think it's could be like it's a useful example to talk about to get a sort of higher level abstract questions. So the like a workshop example, for example, one is like, would you actually make the argument that like the more just action is for the referee to be harsher to the French team? And then also, I was thinking maybe part of the reason why he talks about how like we'll say like, oh, the bias or like performance is the same for these two groups, so therefore our model is like good. I think this like besides there being like issues, like sort of social issues with why we do that, I think there's also maybe like an evaluation issue where like part of why we do that could be just because it's very easy. It's like an easy thing to evaluate, like does this work equally for this? Whereas if you're trying to include like the offset first and then evaluate for that, I think that would be difficult. So I'd also ask like to be thought of how you would evaluate for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with the football question, I'm not gonna answer that because this is being recorded. But I think I'm more confident making stronger assertions in like NLP. But I do think like, so this paper called Algorithmic Reparation, and I do align a lot with like their views, which basically state that because redlining and like the discriminatory like practice of not giving loans to Black individuals, we do need to be over kind of like doing the over granting loans to Black communities. Yeah, so I think algorithms are so widespread and like very commonly used in like housing markets and like financial markets, and so it's good that they also reflect that they're also reparative in some sense, that they like are not blind to identities, but rather try to remediate like past inequity. And the second question, which is on, I think that's actually part of the infrastructures, right? Like, I do think part of it is it's very easy to just compare two numbers. And also the reason that I can't give you a better answer is because like the way in which we do research in this community is like we have to cite somebody else who did it first, and like we need to kind of build off of other people's work. And this is the kind of research that gets cited a lot and the kind of research that gets funded a lot. And so that's what I tend to think about overwhelmingly, because that's what my infrastructure allows me to think about. So I don't have a better answer for you, but I think overall we just need to collectively spend more time thinking about other ways. It's hard. Like it's really hard. It's not something that comes about easily.
Sure, thanks.
I think Katie has a question.
I did, but others can go first.
Can I go?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Anyway, starting with the football example again. So, soccer World Cup, Morocco versus France, and the day before that there was Argentina versus Netherlands, and the Spanish referee thought, hey, Netherlands is a weaker team, so let me start with giving yellow cards to the Argentinian players. So, are we doing that? That is my bigger question. So all these things that the model has learned is from a data set, which is exactly a reflection of the society, right? So are we, or the researchers, the good judge of coming in and saying, let's reduce the bias, but then will it reflect in the society? That's my bigger problem. Like, I would love it to be reflecting on the society, but are we the right judge for it? Like the referee who he decided, like, okay, Netherlands is a weaker team, let me aid them and make it level playing field. Why? It's a societal bias which brought them exactly there.
Are you asserting just as fact that this is what happened?
Or do they eventually they interviewed him, and then Messi came up saying, yeah, we felt like he was, that was just
Yeah, so to your first question, I would kind of contest the idea that the data we train on is exactly reflective society, especially because of the massive porn sites that I was talking about earlier. I don't think most of the data we train contains and also like the stuff about Wikipedia, the data dump, right? Like there's no existences of like neopronouns. It's just not, the distribution is not the same as reality. Most people don't interact with automatically translated massive porn sites, right? Like there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. But with respect to your second question about who is the judge of that, I am of the opinion that we are the judge of that as researchers, because who else will be? I think like we can't just keep on pushing accountability down the road. There's this saying, kicking the can down the road. When I think I was very shocked when I went to not by Europeans, but by the discussions differences between Europeans and Americans about regulation and who is responsible for making these decisions. A lot of Europeans have a lot of faith, especially in France, have a lot of faith in like the central government and their ability to regulate things. But I don't think that actually ends up like getting done. Like really, like I don't think the government has the knowledge all the time to even like know about the kind of stuff that I'm talking about here. And then I grew up in, again, my context, right, is like I grew up in the Bay Area, and so I don't think I trust the government very much, just because I think the American in me doesn't want to trust like the federal government to regulate like a lot of technology properly. And also just because of oppression and things like that and like past legislation. So I think it starts with us, right? Like I don't know which body would do it otherwise, and it can seem like a survival thing for a lot of marginalized communities, right? Like if I don't do it, like that just means that more trans people are going to get harmed, for example, until someone decides that it's appropriate. Like some white dude from Texas decides it's time that trans people can like stop dying.
Just a quick follow-up. I think we are meeting in the afternoon. We can talk on that. So my question was, did we get off on the wrong foot just by going with the co-occurrence concept in the first place? It definitely helped the machine learning models learn a lot of things, but it's also learning all these things co-occurrence-wise, right? Doctors are always men kind of thing. So that's just an open question I have to ask. But we started with co-occurrence with 2014 Pennington's paper glove, and then it went on to word-to-back
cannot answer that, but I like co-occurrences and I like word embeddings. I think they're a really great tool. Yeah, I just think there's that, going back to the pipeline image from earlier, there's just a whole lot of things that factor into the harms that we have from NLP systems that are not just like co-occurrences, although they do play their role too.
Let's contextualize also. We didn't start with co-occurrence in 2014. The first quote is the way of holding that speaking this. Also, linguistically, historically, association.
I think since we're running out of time, we can take one last question from Ulf.
Yes, so very interesting talk, thank you. So you had one great example there, the gender bias, horrible gender bias in the resume scanning. So now you're in charge to fix this. You have 3 to 6 months. What would you do, without creating new biases? And the perspective of the question is, are there shorter term solutions that are feasible for us to work on within 3 or 6 months, or is the goal really to change society over the next 10, 20, 50 years and, just create awareness? So there's, 2 different timelines.
Right.
And so what's your sense specifically for this kind of
this might not be
example?
This might not be the answer you'd like, but I would throw the system away and not improve it. Because I think first off, as soon as you recognize that it's doing something like that, just trash it. That's not something you want to keep on letting happen for 3 to 6 months. But then also job security is a very real thing. Financial disenfranchisement, and income, they're all super important. I know all the grad students in the room are money's good. But I think if something like that is very high stakes and really should be considered more carefully and thought through, then I think you should not really have a machine doing single-handedly. I do think that there is potentially some ways in which we can kind of have human AI collaboration when we're doing these resume screenings, because humans are also not exactly the most fair individuals either. A lot of the recruiters are not always thinking about reparation. They're not always thinking about justice. But I also wonder if these systems have a way of highlighting different parts of people's resume that they recruiters might have missed. But they can't just do it single-handedly. And also definitely not that system, not the one that Amazon used. Because if it's just highlighting things like Scripps College, I don't know if that's something that will feasibly work in a collaboration. You'd have to make the system not make the final decisions. You maybe would want to make it a little bit more bare bones, not output a single value good candidate, bad candidate, but rather highlight things in the text that explain what would contribute to someone's candidacy, and then have someone review that as part of the process.
Cool. So to be respectful of everyone's time, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Arjun offline. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and see you next time.